Hello, I'm Matt Galloway, and this is The Current Podcast. It was the type of scene that has become familiar in Canadian summers, a long line of cars with smoke looming in the background. This time, it was the residents of Churchill Falls in Labrador facing the evacuation order. John Gowdy has been talking about this story all morning as guest host on CBC's Labrador Morning. He is just off the air in Happy Valley, Goose Bay. John, good morning.
Good morning, Matt.
What have the scenes been like out of Churchill Falls? I've seen some of the images, again, the photos of people on the road just trying to get out.
Yes, very dramatic pictures and videos from Churchill Falls. Yesterday evening, residents and people who live and work there received the evacuation order that they were to leave the community. And for the last few days, of course, wildfires have been in the area and crews have been fighting those fires. But yesterday afternoon, a fire close to the community flared up again, and I was speaking with Robert Daw, who is a long time, who's lived in the community for a long time and worked there, and he said that when he saw that, he knew that things were really heating up, and he wasn't terribly surprised when they actually did get the evacuation order that they were to leave, and they got that yesterday evening, and people packing things that they needed to bring with them on short order, and then hit the road and made their way east to Happy Valley Goose Bay, which is about a 3-hour drive.
They had to be out of town by 8:15. That was the deadline.
Yeah, 8:15 in the evening. That's right. So, and they got together and they hit the road. And then along the way, Matt, there was a terrible thunder and lightning storm that swept through the area. And there was one fellow we heard from this morning saying that he was driving through it and he even had thoughts of turning back to Churchill Falls because it was just so wicked.
Oh, my goodness.
So, yeah, I know. So it was quite the storm last night. People made their way to Happy Valley Goose Bay, and the YMCA was the check-in point. The YMCA here in town was the check-in point for people. And they opened their doors to the evacuees. And I believe about 85 folks did stay in the YMCA overnight. But there were hundreds of people live and work in Churchill Falls. And so that was the check-in point. And so other people stayed at friends and families. And what was actually quite amazing, Matt, was that people in the community here were really opening their doors to evacuees, like whether they're staying in their cabins or their own homes. Like, if they had cats, they say, well, yeah, you can stay here. This place is pet friendly. So you're welcome to stay here. So people have been very, very supportive of the people who had to make the move on short order from Churchill Falls yesterday evening.
And I guess, have you heard what that move was like, aside from the fact that they got a warm welcome when they finally got to Happy Valley? But given that there's one road out, everything went fairly smoothly?
Yeah, it did. Yeah, when I was speaking with Robert Daw live on the show this morning, he was saying that, people just got into their vehicles. It was very, very well ordered from the sounds of it. No one was passing each other on the highway because, there's just one highway that stretches across Labrador. And it's a 3-hour drive to Happy Valley Goose Bay one way and about 2.5 hours the other way to Labrador West of the two communities of Wawash and Labrador City. And so we were speaking with the mayor, Linda Adams, the mayor of Labrador City, where they also supported people, putting people up in the town, and in both towns, like there were people, they were being fed and given shelter, and at the Salvation, for example, at the YMCA, the Salvation Army had their truck out, and this morning they were preparing breakfast for people there. So it's really been quite a group effort, a real team effort to respond to this. But from the looks of it, it's been quite successful, and I'd say kudos out to everyone who played a part in this.
Any sense as to how long people are going to be out of their homes? You could imagine, given what they were fleeing and the urgency with which they had to leave, that people are wondering what's happening back home.
I think that's the same thing. That's the same question everyone has on their mind, Matt. Like, they don't really know. They know that the fire crews are, again, on the scene, and they're assessing the situation. I guess yesterday, like when the fire closest to the town, because there actually are a couple of fires burning, but the one that was closest to the town still it was a few kilometers away, and so they're on the scene there trying to assess. But when it broke through sort of the perimeter of the safety perimeter, I guess that's when the call was made to do the evacuation order. But yeah, crews are back there again this morning, and they're continuing with their helicopters and the water bombers dousing the fire. But I guess it's kind of everyone's guess, right, about what's going to happen.
Just before I let you go, I mean, Churchill Falls is a hydro company town, and
That's right.
You're in the midst of this heat wave, like many people in the eastern part of the country. Our humidex is high. People might have the air conditioner cranked right up. You can wonder whether people are worried about power in the region.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it is Churchill Falls provides power, and some of that power goes right into Quebec, right? So it's very much the source of power for the grid. And there are crews actually who did stay behind in Churchill Falls to make sure that the infrastructure, the power is still being generated. But that's a big concern, right? Like if the fire were to break through and impact infrastructure and buildings and the grid, in Churchill Falls, that would be a whole other story. That would be another conversation we had to be having. But it's definitely on people's minds.
John, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Matt.
John Gowdy is the guest host of Labrador Morning. He was in Happy Valley, Goose Bay, Labrador. As I mentioned, the heat wave that is across much of the eastern part of Canada and the United States, hitting there as well. The humidex values in the high 30s for parts of Labrador. This heat dome continues to hover over much of eastern Canada and the Maritimes. Millions of people have been under heat alerts for days. Ottawa recorded its hottest day of the year on Wednesday. Prince Edward Island broke a heat record, 31.5 degrees in Charlottetown. The hottest place in the country, Bathurst, New Brunswick, 37.6 degrees. These school children were having a tough time in Toronto, where the temperature hit 34 degrees.
When everybody in my class is hot, they just can't pay attention. We're usually in partners during work. While I'm in partners with my friends, then I usually can't really pay attention because of the heat, and I don't really focus on a lot of work.
They do come home pretty tired and miserable, and we realize that since the heat has started going up, they've started coming home tired and miserable, so it correlates one with the other.
We send them healthy. We want them to come home healthy. And we want that for all the kids at the school. There's kids with underlying health conditions where this makes things, extreme heat makes it worse for them. My middle daughter's come home with heat exhaustion. We've taken her to the doctor, and we've been advised that if she gets any of these symptoms again, to take her straight to emerge.
Seniors are also vulnerable to extreme heat. In Montreal, seniors at a drop-in centre are adapting as best they can.
We're all going to have to deal with it in the sense that, understand that that's the way it's going to be, and we certainly have no choice. So you have to kind of accommodate yourself and other people with the increased heat. It's true, it's much more than it was 20 or 30 years ago.
There's splash pads for kids, but there's no splash pads for seniors.
That's a good idea, actually. The health impacts of extreme heat can be devastating, and as summer heat waves intensify, advocates say access to cooling should be treated as a human right. Blair Feltmate is head of the Intact Centre on Climate Adaptation at the University of Waterloo. He is in Calgary. Blair, hello.
Good morning.
What does that mean, access to cooling as a fundamental human right?
Well, we have to make it such that when the heat waves hit, people that are particularly vulnerable to extreme heat, which tends to be the low-income earners, particularly elderly, and those with pre-existing medical conditions that may be respiratory and or cardiac in nature. These are people that when they're exposed to extreme heat, it's not just discomfort, they can actually die. And we've seen this in Canada, for example, the extreme events of extreme heat with deaths. For example, in BC in 2021, 619 people died prematurely due to extreme heat. In Quebec in 2018, 86 people died prematurely due to extreme heat. And the extreme heat that we're experiencing now, which is very, very challenging and we're breaking records, more extreme heat is on its way, driven by climate change. So as bad as things are right now and challenging as they may be, more extreme heat is coming. And we need to make access to cooling, particularly for those vulnerable groups that I just mentioned. We have to give them access to cooling, otherwise they will succumb.
So what does that mean? Again, we heard that senior talk about the idea of splash pads for seniors, which I think might sound very refreshing on a hot day like a lot of people are going through right now. But are we talking about air conditioning? Is that what access to cooling means?
There's two components to it, but there's active cooling and there's passive cooling. Active cooling is air conditioning. And so what we need is particularly for seniors, this is the most vulnerable group, so I'll zero in on those. we need to make sure that they have at least one cool room in their apartment. One room that they can go into that has air conditioning. It can be as simple as a 5,000 BTU air conditioner that can cool that room down and give people a place to go and be safe when extreme heat hits. And we may have to implement programs through a means test to identify that these are certain elderly people, they simply can't afford an air conditioner on their own.
So you give subsidies for air conditionings?
Yes, exactly.
What else beyond air conditioning? I mean, that's one thing. We've talked about the idea, and you see them in some urban centers, but perhaps there aren't enough, the idea of more cooling centers as the climate continues to change and those heat waves get longer and longer.
Yeah, we can have cooling centers, we can have misting stations, but also we need to have more shade, tree canopy within cities to give people a place to go and escape the direct impacts of the sunlight when they're outside. But in apartments, for example, we also need to retrofit such that we have either glazing on windows or awnings over windows or mechanical shutters to keep the sunlight out of apartment units, more venting within buildings to allow heat to escape up and out of a building passively. So we need a combination of both passive and active cooling working sort of hand in glove to keep temperatures tolerable. For example, you see this in much of Europe, where awnings are on almost every apartment building you look at. They have real awnings that extend out over balconies that attenuate sunlight from coming into units, combined with heat pumps or air conditioning. And the two working together can keep the temperature inside the units tolerable.
The organization that represents migrant farm workers says that in heat waves like the ones that are roaring through parts of Canada and the United States right now, those who are out picking our strawberries or planting for a later harvest, they need to be considered as well. And some of those farms should be shut down if it's that hot. Do you go that far?
I don't know about shutting them down, but certainly for people that work outside, people exposed to extreme heat all day, we need changes in the time of day that they work. In other words, starting early in the morning and probably finishing work by noon before the extreme intense heat of the day hits. So we're going to increasingly so we are going to see adjustments in the time of day people work for those who work outside under when the extreme heat conditions hit. And by the way, extreme heat is in a different category than all other manifestations of climate change and extreme weather risk, where we're talking about flooding or wildfires or other means of expressions of extreme weather. Because with flooding and wildfires, when these events occur, by and large, people don't die, or it's in very low numbers, maybe 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 people. And I don't mean to be insensitive, like more than one person dying is one too many. But with extreme heat, it's the one when things go wrong, people die, and they die in very high numbers, in the hundreds and if not into the thousands.
And your sense is, just before I let you go, that if governments don't take this on in a meaningful way, that those numbers will just go up?
Absolutely, definitely. We will have events where it won't just be hundreds, it will be thousands of people dying. In Europe in 2022, we had 61,000 people succumb to heat attributable deaths, and we're not immune to that in Canada.
Blair, thank you very much for this.
Thank you for having me.
Blair Feltmate is the head of the Intact Centre on Climate Adaptation at the University of Waterloo. South of the border, more than 70 million Americans are also under a heat warning.
Oh my God, it's going to be hot.
These are potential record highs from Louisville, Detroit, Cleveland, Buffalo, Syracuse.
It is exceptionally hot, even for this area.
This is extremely hot for June, and New Yorkers should not underestimate the heat.
When you have this hot, humid weather, slight exertions make it really difficult on these kids, and they're little.
This is a long-duration event that could actually be deadly if you are exposed to this heat long enough.
Jean Su is Energy Justice Director at the Center for Biological Diversity in the United States, lead author of a petition that calls for extreme heat events and wildfire smoke to be classified as major disasters. She's in Washington, D.C. this morning. Jean, hello to you.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for having me.
You're in the heat wave zone as well.
Absolutely in it.
And so, I mean, aside from, the sweating that you're going through right now, why are you petitioning the Federal Emergency Management Agency in the United States, FEMA, to classify heat events and wildfire smoke as major disasters?
Yeah, so in the United States, our premier management agency, FEMA, isn't fit for purpose to deal with extreme heat, which is actually, as your past guest just said, is actually the number one weather killer in the United States right now. It actually trumps tornadoes, floods, and hurricanes by twofold, the number of deaths that it does. And right now, we have a management system that's ill-equipped to deal with it. So for decades, FEMA has really looked at disasters, measuring them by property damage. And so they're saying, okay, if that hurricane rips off your roof, we're just going to pay to get your roof back on. But extreme heat is a totally new ballgame. And they have not responded in the past to requests for extreme heat. And that's why we are petitioning them to take an aggressive, proactive plan to deal with extreme heat in a systematic way, because it is such an incredible killer.
Specifically, what would that mean? What would that mean for people who are living through heat waves like we're in right now?
Absolutely. So your past guest actually outlined a number of measures that we are advocating for. We, in terms of short-term measures, we're looking at cooling centers, resilience centers for wildfire smoke, air filtration centers. All of those are very important resilience pieces. But in particular, in this petition, we teamed up with the largest labor unions in the country, as well as environmental justice organizations and public health officials who really work with low-income communities. And so the communities that are most, at the forefront, at the fence line of the climate emergency here in the U.S. are workers and low-income communities. And so placing those community resilience centers strategically in those worker communities and low-income communities, building them such that people can walk to them, that they don't have to get into their car where it's accessible. That is a huge construction effort and infrastructure effort that they are wanting. But on top of that, low-income communities and worker communities here in the U.S. in particular live in really poor building stock. And when I talk about that, it is heat, or basically they're called urban heat islands, where in Portland, Oregon, for example, Black communities live in unshaded areas of the neighborhood that experience temperatures and heat that are 15 degrees Fahrenheit higher than their white counterparts in shaded areas. And it's not only kind of lack of tree cover, but also lack of insulation. And so a big push on this is also to get insulation in those areas to plug up these holy buildings that will keep both wildfire smoke out and cooling in, as well as actually getting cooling heat pumps in for them.
We just have a minute or so left. And I'm loath to ask this because everything is political, it seems like. But how political is this? I had read that Ron DeSantis, governor of Florida, Greg Abbott in Texas, both signed legislation preventing local governments from requiring heat protections for outdoor workers. That suggests that there's a political dimension to something like this.
Unfortunately, there is a political dimension to this. And unfortunately, as I said before, the people who are most impacted are the most disenfranchised communities in the U.S. And unfortunately, there is a bipartisan or basically a partisan view about Democrats who care about those communities and Republicans who don't. That's why we're asking for federal protections, because states in the U.S. are so checker-spotted in the types of policies that they can pass. And so federal policy will help plug up the holes in the checker spot nature of unfair policies. Just
very briefly, is your sense that momentum is moving in your direction as the temperature? We're talking about what's happening in Washington, D.C. In Phoenix, it's going to be 113 degrees Fahrenheit, 45 degrees Celsius today.
Absolutely. Last year we experienced extreme heat, and because of your devastating Canadian wildfires, people on the east coast of the country finally understood how dangerous wildfire smoke is, which is totally unfathomable. And so I think there was shock last year, and then this year we're going to be experiencing a record-breaking heat wave again, as well as wildfire smoke. So I hope that this year we can actually get the preemptive measures necessary.
Jean, thank you very much for this. Very timely.
Great. Thanks so much for having me.
Jean Sue is Energy Justice Director at the Center for Biological Diversity in the United States and lead author of a petition that went to FEMA earlier this week.